Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hello and welcome to the ISO Show. Today's podcast is going to be on part 3 of our ISO 14001 Steps to Success in Implementing the Environmental Management Standard, ISO 14001. And this is with Derek Hall, MBE, here at Blackmores, a senior consultant who's going to be sharing with us his hints and tips on how to do the final stages of your implementation project, which includes internal audits and management review. So they're the two topics that we're going to be focusing on. It's the critical stages prior to an assessment. Before the assessor walks through the door, you've got to make sure that you've got an internal audit procedure in place, you've got an audit schedule, and you've carried out internal audits. And not just obviously to make sure that you've covered everything, but to make sure that the system is actually effective and working for you rather than against you. And the management review meeting is also the final stage, which basically draws a line under the work that you've done so far and captures the performance of the environmental management system. So we've got it on record, again, prior to the assessment. Welcome back, Derek.
Hello, Mel. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Recording this on a Friday, so
Okay.
going out tonight, so in a good spirits. But also, obviously, we've been really pleased with all the hints and tips that you've been sharing with our listeners in the previous episodes on implementing 14001. So it'd be really good just to wrap up, really, in terms of the final stages of a project.
Okay. Well, let's imagine you've put in the management system, it's all working and being effectively controlled. You really need to vet that really is happening. So you need to hold a series of audits. And I find the best way on a newer system is to thoroughly audit against the clauses of the standards. So call it 14001 on this particular standard. And we'll be looking at, I think I said earlier, about the different areas, context of the organisation, leadership, planning, support, operations, etc. So I think probably the best way, and the way I tend to work, is I'll develop an audit schedule, and that schedule will contain all of those topic areas, so then I can look in a systematic way at auditing the company. So
Can I just interrupt you there for a second? Taking us right back to basics, for those listeners that may not have had an ISO 14001 internal audit, how would you describe an audit, and what do they need to prepare, or what should they expect?
Well, I think what you're trying to do on an audit is to look at gaps within the system. We would have already looked at that with a gap analysis. Hopefully a lot of those gaps would have been filled by the time of the audit. But once the audit sort of starts, we're looking at any other gaps in the system and where the system can be improved. Bear in mind, audits are about improvement. Now, within an audit, we'd raise probably 4 different levels of issues. One could be a major non-conformity, which means you've got a serious problem and you're not ready. It could be minor non-conformities, which are gaps in the system. There could be observation, there's something weak about the system, so there could be some weaknesses within that system. And the other one are opportunities for improvement, which speaks for itself really, it's an opportunity to improve something. Within each audit we will be identifying those factors and against the clauses of the standard. It's important to put it into some systematic format to begin with, because it's a new system. Now, as the system evolves, etc., and on future audits, what you can do is use different types of audits. There's a process called vertical auditing, where you could just literally take, one sheet of paper, like a purchase order, and check that all the way through the company. In different ways, let's say. But to begin with, I think it's good for the company to get a more rounded review on where the gaps are in the system.
So that's the different types of audit findings And so if I am going to be audited by you, and I've never been audited before.
Haven't you now?
Well, I have actually, and by you, Derek.
Oh, thank you.
Which is actually is a really good experience. I've enjoyed that. Honestly, because you always find opportunities for improvement, which is something that I think is a great strength of an experienced auditor. You don't even need to know anything about the procedure. Anyway, so taking a step back, I am completely new and I haven't been audited before. Could you just explain to our listeners what to expect in an audit?
Well, first of all, we'd hold an introductory meeting, so we introduce one another, get a feeling for what you do, what the auditor himself would be expecting within that audit, and people or processes that I'd like to see within that audit. And try ring fence the audit to the subject matter that you're looking at. So say for instance, support. So in support, I'm going to be looking at training records, I'm going to be looking at competency, I'm going to be looking at maybe the infrastructure of the building. So I've got to sort of focus on what I'm looking at.
And ideally, you're going to be speaking to the process owners of those.
Correct.
So if I'm working in a warehouse, for example,
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily going to have access to the training records because it could be the HR manager that you need
Correct.
to speak to.
Yeah.
So each individual within a company, they don't need to have the answers to absolutely everything in the management system,
Correct.
do they? It's got to be focused to the right people for the right processes.
Correct. And there's confidentiality that comes within that. So if we're looking at training records, we might ask to look at the appraisal process, but we won't look at the appraisal because it's confidential information. But we want to see that there's an effective process being carried out. So we try to ring fence the day. So, one day it could be support, another day it could be operations. Now, operations, which is Clause 8, is a big subject area to most companies. So that in itself would be broken down into different subject matters.
Okay.
So we could be looking at, waste control on one day. We can be looking at emergency preparedness on another day. So we try to break it down into simple parts, let's say. But going through some sort of systematic process, as I said earlier, because it's a new system.
Absolutely. And I guess do you get some cases where employees haven't heard of the management system or...
Correct.
Yeah. So in some cases it's a bit of an education for them as well. If they haven't attended any awareness training on the management system, I guess that's where it's really important to make sure that the system's been effectively communicated before you go in and do the internal audit.
Correct, yeah. And this is why you need some breathing space between the production of procedures and processes.
Good point, yeah.
You need the gaps before you then come in and audit. Otherwise, you're going to be discovering what you know already. There are gaps in the process.
So talking about gaps in the process and ISO 14001 specifically, in your experience, Derek, where would you say are the main areas of non-conformance that you see over and over again in businesses? So this could be a company that, well, in some cases, obviously, you see the gaps in the gap analysis, but this can be businesses that you go into just to audit, and they've already got 14,001 in place.
Okay, probably Clause 8, so operations, would be a key area, because it's a company does. Another key area would be documentation, because what are you looking at when you're auditing? You're looking at evidence, and that normally leads you to some documentation. That could be physical or electronic documentation. And quite often that's where you'll discover errors, or potentially you could discover errors.
With you. So going back to what you said earlier about the main areas being Clause 8, operations, could you give me an example of a non-conformity that is quite common in businesses for 14,001 in that clause?
Well, it's sort of combined with documentation, the completion of waste transfer documentation notes. It's an operational thing, but it's also a document or documents. And quite often you'll find they haven't been filled out correctly.
So it could be a SIC code, for example, which is the responsibility of the waste company, but they haven't checked that that's been done.
Yeah, or it could be proof of Part E consignment returns, which is the proof that your waste has been correctly disposed of. They can be pretty key areas. And certainly with involved operations, for example, construction. It's quite an involved process, and there's a lot of documentation flying around at different sites, so it can be quite involved.
So a lot of companies then are missing out on these things, and by checking it, obviously it's the 14,001 and we're checking this prior to an assessment because it's part of an implementation project, but not only that, we're identifying where they're not meeting legal requirements then, aren't we?
Oh yes. Compliance
which businesses should be doing on a daily basis, but without that audit function.
Compliance obligations, and
know.
I think I said earlier about you've got legal and other requirements, but you've also got compliance obligations. You should know the legal requirements, but compliance obligations could be simply filling out waste transfer documentation.
So at the end of that audit, there could be some findings, as you mentioned. There might be a minor non-conformity or an OFI, an opportunity for improvement. And so I guess the next stage is for them to address that and implement the corrective action prior to the assessment.
Yeah. Now we normally develop a thing called a continuous improvement log, which identifies the non-conformities or the observations raised. And then it's really client's responsibility to take corrective action for closing those out. And that's also a key area that we'd focus on within audits. So on future audits, we'd be checking that the previous issues raised have been closed.
Yeah, so they're not firefighting then, are they?
Exactly.
They're looking at preventing those issues from reoccurring. Yeah. Excellent. So we've done all of our internal audits then, and then it's management review time. In your view, Derek, what's the main value from carrying out this meeting?
Well, management review, you're really looking at the system. You're looking at the whole of the system. You're looking at performance. You're looking at have internal audits been held. You're looking at compliance obligations. You're looking at aspects. You're looking at objectives, etc., etc. So there's a whole list in the standard that is quite prescriptive. It will tell you exactly what you should be looking at. And that's helpful because when
there's no excuses then.
No, but it's helpful in a meeting because when meetings tend to go sort of sideways a little bit, people will introduce certain views, etc. And our job is to bring them back to the subject matter. So the subject matter is, I hear what you're saying, but we're looking at aspects here, or we're looking at your objectives here. It's normally an annual process. We normally hold them annually, even though we could hold them more than that. And certainly in the early days of a management system, we might hold 2 a year. But it's really looking at the whole of the system, let's say.
So what value do you think that brings a business then?
Well, the value is it gives them more of a strategic overview of the business and an overview of where the risks are and the opportunities are and the gaps. And also setting targets and agreeing aims for the future. And guess what? Then at the following management review, we're looking at how well those issues have been achieved, let's say.
Yeah. So businesses don't often get the opportunity to take a step back, do they? So that they can do that strategic review.
True.
And then get the value for reviewing performance against objectives and looking at what's happened over the last 12 months in terms of changes in legislation and review of suppliers as well. And so obviously it's a worthwhile exercise.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay, great. So is there anything else that you'd like to add then, Derek, before we're ready for the assessment?
Well, just remember that it's a structured process, but it's also a fluid process. There's no absolute rights or wrongs when you're sort of carrying out the process. But then again, you need to follow the structures or the clauses laid down in the standard. But the clauses laid down in the standard will mean different things to different organisations. Which
is why it's really important to have a bespoke environmental management system, isn't it? Because each business is different and they will interpret the standard in different ways.
Yeah, it comes back to, I think, what I said earlier, and that's understanding company culture.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for sharing over these 3 episodes your experience and knowledge around the implementation of ISO 14001. That's been really helpful for our listeners, especially any of those that are just considering 14001 and wondering what's involved. So thank you very much for that, Derek. And I know we've got future episodes coming up with you, breaking down specific aspects of environmental and sustainability management that I'm looking forward to interviewing you on, where we can pin you down for the time to do it. When you're not doing karate and various other things that you do in your spare time.
Yes, there's always karate.
So before we leave, Derek, I know that you're an avid reader. Have you got a book that you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
Well, say several books, but one book it's a little bit older now. It's called Gaia. That's Gaia. And it's a subtitle, A New Look at Life on Earth. And it's talking about exploring the hypothesis that the Earth is a living matter, air, ocean and land surfaces that form a complex system that has a capacity to keep the Earth a fit place for life. Now, it's quite a deep read, but basically I think what it's saying is that we live on a interlinking, interactive planet. So everything we do has an effect, in fact cause and effect. And we're probably seeing that in more recent times with climate change, plastic pollution in the oceans, the effect that the human species is having on various animals, turtles being one.
We know turtles are one of your favourites, Derek, so we've got a turtle diagram podcast coming up in the future.
but yes, it's the interconnection. And the author is James Lovelock.
James Lovelock.
Yeah, okay. And well worth reviewing. There's the whole series of books.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I haven't actually heard of those before, so I'll be checking those out.
He's getting on, I think. I think he's about 100 now.
Oh.
Believe it or not.
Okay, well, thanks once again, Derek. It's been really great to interview you and delve into the topic of implementing 14001 in greater detail. If you've enjoyed listening to these podcasts, it'd be great for you to leave a review for us. We are available on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spotify, and of course YouTube. So if you get the opportunity, I know that you're all very busy people, but if you get that opportunity to leave us with a review and also any feedback on any potential podcasts you'd like to hear in the future, we'd be delighted to receive those reviews and feedback. And also just to let you know that there's further information on our website. There's always a blog post that goes with these podcasts with links to additional information. So always worth visiting our website. That's www.blackmoresuk.com. And also on there is a link to the Steps to Success services that we offer, which is obviously if you need a hand with implementing ISO 14001, we'd be more than happy to have a chat through that with you and provide further information free of charge. So without further ado, I look forward to catching you on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice?